Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session at East Africa Com. Today's topic is we're going to be discussing the future goals for East African telecoms. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a fireside chat with Mrs. Mitwa Ngambi of MTN Rwanda, and the CEO of MTN Rwanda. So quite a challenge, I believe, that you have. And what I'm going to be doing in this discussion is I'm actually going to sort of fudge the discussion a little bit and actually ask a very focused question about what are the goals for telcos in East Africa, and both what your company's goals are, but also what you anticipate the goals of some of your competitors or rivals to be, and what goals need to be attained for us to see an investment boom. So I'm sort of going to take a little bit of a public spin on it and sort of go, what does MTN Rwanda and its rivals need to accomplish in the short term so that Africa can see this sort of investment boom, not in telcos necessarily, but in digital economies. And that's what we're going to be taking as the discussion. And Mitwa, I hope I've sort of captured your role and your job description reasonably well. Anything that I've bungled up so far?
No, that's perfect, Paul. And thanks for having me. Good afternoon to everyone who's joining us from across the globe, I believe. And you're absolutely right. I think across the industry, irrespective of the mobile operator or telecommunication company that you speak to, I think across the industry, there's alignment in terms of the desire to fully attain connectivity and connected lives across the continent, specifically to MTN Group and naturally also to MTN Rwanda. The ultimate goal for us is to make sure that every single person across our footprint is connected digitally. And of course, in doing so, we've carved out a very ambitious strategy. We call it Ambition 2025, which we hope by 2025 would have achieved the position of leading connectivity solutions for Africa's progress. And that's what it's really about. It's about really delivering digital solutions in order to further Africa's progress. And in order to do so, we have carved out quite a few goals, which I don't think are too unique to MTN Group, but we've been very clear in articulating what those are. Number one, before we can talk about any form of digital economy booming, is obviously the fundamental around network connectivity. And you'd see across the entire continent, and it's a subject that we've spoken about for many East Africa comms before, but it still remains quite topical for the continent because our network coverage across the continent is roughly about 80%. And some countries have done much better than others. For instance, out here in Rwanda, we boast of a population coverage of north of 98%, which is pretty strong in the region. But the reality is, in some of the other markets, some of the other countries, we still have quite a bit of room to go in terms of covering the entire population as far as network connectivity is concerned. So the primary goal at the underlying foundational basis is to make sure connectivity reaches every single last person across the geographies that we serve. So connectivity is the one main goal, I would say, coming out what the priorities are. Now, subsequent to that, and as the last 2 years have taught us as well, in as much as a lot of mobile operators in the past years have been focused on mobile connectivity, mobile infrastructure, the last 2.5 years have taught us that we have to also mature into the home and building space, right? Because you never know when the next pandemic is going to hit, and you want to make sure that your home office is adequately equipped, adequately covered in form of stable connectivity. And you'd have seen a lot of investments and pronouncements by a lot of mobile operators, including ourselves, MTN Rwanda, under the ambit of MTN Group, as to the number of homes we'd like to digitally connect over the next few years. So another goal in cementing and really solidifying infrastructure and network connectivity is also the pivot into the home space. And you'd see this delivered around fixed wireless and fiber deployments across the countries. Now, between these two, I would say would be the one primary goal to start with. But I think in talking about connectivity, we can't ignore the discussions around smartphone penetration as well, because before we even start talking about the thriving of digital economies, we have to make sure that people actually have tools to access the digital world that we're trying to create. And if it's one conundrum that I think we have as a continent, it really would be this: after connectivity, right? So what we're seeing in a lot of the countries across the continent is that while we're making very big strides in closing the network coverage gaps across our footprints, the reality is that now we're creating a new gap, which we're now calling the usage gap, right? So network infrastructure is seemingly available. The number of people who have access to it by virtue of them not having devices to do so is now the focus of a lot of the operators. So another goal would be to really crack the dilemma around smartphones, where we see across the continent, roughly about 40% smartphone penetration. In some markets, much stronger. You have the likes of South Africa, Nigeria in excess of 60, 70%. But you have, for instance, Rwanda, where smartphone penetration is still roughly about 20. So the goal, I think, would be, apart from network connectivity, to really crack and make sure the devices that we need to put in people's hands to access this connectivity and therefore unlock the potential of digital economies is actually attained. On top of that, of course, then becomes the conversations around the digital applications, etc. But before we could even get there, the fundamentals would need to be in place.
Speaking of the fundamentals, I'm very, very glad that you sort of touched into the usage gap regarding smartphones, because the last sort of in-person major event that I attended, in year one pre-pandemic, was AfricaCom in Cape Town, and a topic that had been run for sort of the last 3 years and comes up is to do with the availability of devices. And, KaiOS, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, I've been on a panel with them, have a wonderful project. Make absolutely no mistake about it. It is an absolutely wonderful project and one that should be widely supported. However, the devices that they're creating, and every single Android device, let's consider every single smartphone Android device, is materially different for a user than a laptop or desktop computer. I divide devices between those with a keyboard and those without. And the divide tends to sort of also run along a line between devices that are primarily for consumption of media or consumption of material and content, and devices that are used for the creation. And one of the things which I'm concerned about, and I'm not certain exactly who all needs to come on board. So one of the concerns that therefore arises is that we could find ourselves in a situation where we have a 95% connectivity for the purposes of the consumption of content, but only approximately 5% connectivity with individuals having the means by which to create and produce content. And so I'm not entirely certain, as I said earlier, as to where we should put the responsibility. And it isn't the traditional business of mobile network operators to be rolling out, laptop computers or one child per laptop type devices. But that does seem to me to be a very real challenge, and especially to create a next generation of digital nomads. And I was just wondering your thoughts on that. And I'm hoping I'm not pushing you too hard to make an unannounced commitment on MTN Group and get you in trouble.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think it's a preoccupation that a lot of operators have as well. In the quest or drive to close smartphone penetration gaps, the last thing you want to do is have in the market devices that are not able to adequately consume the digital services that you deliver. But the reality also is that there is quite the challenge around affordability on the continent. And as you know, the higher spec devices or even the larger screen devices such as laptops, tablets tend to be on the higher end of the scale. But I wouldn't say it would be all doom and gloom, because we are seeing the proliferation of a lot of different device financing models, which could necessarily also bring down the cost of overall device. So in as much as we're trying to cater for all segments of affordability, we want to make sure that the right devices are in the right hands by also exploring aspects of device financing, which could break down that initial cost of investment on a consumer perspective over weeks, months, and years. So I think it's about finding the right balance in between. We do have the drive and the ambition to close smartphone penetration, but at the same time, we'd like to drive adoption. And that's where we'd see options such as device financing playing quite a key role.
No, that makes me quite optimistic. And it is important to also recognize, I think, that we do have a wide array of different consumers on the continent. There are many consumers on the continent who are quite happy to pay for very expensive luxury devices, regardless of the functionality, purely as a status symbol. And those who have the means to do so, do so and should be doing so in a manner that contributes to the market. The people purchasing overpriced feature phones, or not feature phones, luxury smartphones, can carry the market to an extent. What I'm also picking up from your sort of general importance of connectivity and coverage gap is that the reality is that even without the use of new technologies, we actually have already seen a lot of the network investment that is needed to achieve high levels of coverage. Now more of a capacity constraint than a coverage constraint in some markets. In more rural or less densely populated areas, of course, the coverage gap, remains more complicated to finance. But I'm always interested when we, hear of things like low Earth orbit satellite connectivity or the like, because it often to me sounds more like marketing material than necessarily impact. And that comes from a little bit of a bias on my point towards feeling that the answer is fiber. In the long term. In the short term, we need to connect with whatever we can connect. But in the long term, the more fiber we have in the ground, the more wireless connectivity we can deliver. But I am sort of wondering both whether my bias is marginally justified, at least in the context of Rwanda. I understand it's not justified in the Karoo, where we have more cows than people. More sheep than people, I think. My culture is very limited, but certainly where it matters, I'm inclined to the view that concentration and penetration matters a lot more than additional coverage and the like. But I am wondering how much of a case you are seeing a need just to focus on those boring aspects of investment in connectivity, and how much there is actually novel solutions that do have a great appeal, how much change of the market structure, things like power companies having emerged, getting the network operators to collaborate and share tower infrastructure and change their business models. How much of an eye, should we have on novel connectivity solutions, and how much should we have on just the boring concrete and laying pipes?
No, listen, I wouldn't discount the novel technologies just as yet at all. The likes of LEO. Most recently, I was reading about the successful pilot of towers in space as an example. And while they seem very abstract and very far-fetched, very far out there, the reality is that the industry needs innovations such as these, because the demands around capacity requirements are only set to grow. I don't think we've even scratched the surface for Africa, When we look at the penetration, like I mentioned earlier, we're currently sitting, in sub-Saharan Africa of about 50% mobile penetration. Now, if we manage to unlock the other subscribers who haven't connected to the digital world yet, and overlay on that some of the use cases that we know would solve some of our African continental realities and challenges, I only believe that the broadband requirements are set to increase. Now, of course, as an industry, we welcome any experimentation and innovations that could eventually lead to technologies that will help us bring our operational costs down. So I wouldn't discount them just as yet. Of course, at the moment, it's still very early to tell what those commercial models or entry market or go-to-market strategies would be. I don't think there have been pronouncements as to what commercial models these types of solutions would come into market. And historically, space or satellite types of solutions have tended to be quite expensive. And that is why you see the reliance, as you said, quote unquote, on the boring technologies, which we know are predictable in form of cost. And we know over the years, radio equipment, antenna equipment, physical fiber equipment has been coming down in form of cost. So I think there's still quite a bit of room for these, spatial, I would call them spatial solutions to mature and grow. But I wouldn't discount them just as yet, because as an industry, we welcome every single day innovations that can allow us to bring our operational costs down, that will allow us to invest a whole lot more to unlock the digital potential that we see in the continent.
Great. I was just thinking I probably shouldn't be too pessimistic or critical of space-based technology, as I might find myself being banned from Twitter or attacked by certain tech brews online. But no, I'm inclined to see the case. Something else though that I am also quite interested in, and it does tie into one of my big talking points at almost all of these events, and that is the importance of collaboration,
right.
The importance of partnering up. I frequently, point out that mobile network operators in particular, but just telcos in general, do have a lot to gain by working together. I understand sometimes there are competition authority concerns and the like, but where are we on that? To what extent are you confident that MTN's commitment over the last 5 years to the sort of 5G era and the move from being a telco to a techco is bearing fruit, but also is being matched and is actually being implemented rather than just spoken about?
Right. No, I see massive opportunity for collaboration to propel industry players' progress across the board. And when we talk collaboration, you mentioned collaboration with fellow competitors or mobile operators or other telco players, but even more importantly, with some of the authorities, governments of the nation states that we operate in. And if I can talk first and foremost of the journey that we've had as MTN-RAN and MTN Group over the last 5 years in form of collaboration, and I've seen most recently a lot of conversations around how do we share our infrastructure so we can essentially improve our operational efficiencies to serve and better compete within the markets that we operate in. National roaming, as an example, which we've recently signed not only in Cameroon, but in Ghana as well, is just a testament of our collaborative stance as a group. And I think you'll see a whole lot more areas of collaboration also into the future, because there's an understanding that in as much as we are all competitors in each market and we're all, really focused on increasing our share of the pie, I think there's also general understanding that we'd rather also increase the size of the pie to make sure that we're all generating value for our shareholders. So on the collaborative front, and I would like to say it's a collaborative competition, I would say. And I think there's a general understanding and acknowledgement that that kind of approach is what's going to help us propel each and every one of us to achieve our goals of unlocking digital economies, much faster. From a local or nation state perspective, I see a huge opportunity there. And I think Rwanda is, a pure case study around the success of public and private partnerships. Within the Rwandan space, you may have read most recently the launch of the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Now, this has never happened across the continent. And the backing or the thought process around initiatives like that is to bring public sector, private sector, activists, consumer protection agencies round sitting across the table, really trying to understand how is it that we can shape policy, shape regulation that doesn't allow us to fall behind the curve of technological advancement. So you see a lot of efforts between the private sector and governments to make sure that we're all speaking the same language, because at the end of the day, we're all trying to achieve the same thing in terms of getting people connected to this digital world. There are many, many case studies that I can speak about, but I think in my experience, especially being out here in Rwanda, the most successful initiatives that we've ran, if I'm completely honest with you, have been those where we've collaborated with the nation state authorities, be it through rural connectivity, where the Universal Access Fund that we all contribute to as an industry, we're actually sitting down and determining where should this be invested in which rural area, based on the insights that we have on data, the insights that they have in terms of a nation-state agenda, and you'd see a whole lot more connectivity being unlocked that way, to the point where Rwanda, I think, is one of the few countries today that can say they're above 98% in terms of population coverage. So huge merit to public, competitive collaboration across the industry in helping us further our goals to lead digital for the companies that we serve.
Great. No, I think there is a very, very, very strong case and case study, or many case studies from the continent of instances in which this has been done well. I fear I'll get into trouble if I speak too much about our own regulator, because unfortunately our telcos and our regulator do seem to speak quite a bit, but it is usually through their barristers. It is often in litigation, which is always problematic. What I'm also picking up is that if we look at Connect Rwanda as a project, if we look at how these goals have been reached, that there is a long-term strategy, that there is a profound belief in this continent, and that that MTN is committed to this continent for the long term, and is optimistic. One of the challenges that I see, though, is that despite this commitment, despite a lot of the success in parts of this strategy, is that we're not seeing all of the fruit all of the time. We are seeing fruit, and it's sometimes very good to actually hear from the company its success stories, sort of coming out. But at the end of the day, we aren't where we would like to be. And keeping momentum towards that commitment does require people to step over a lot of Afro-pessimism. And, unfortunately, a lot of Afro-pessimism is deeply rooted in racism and is deeply problematic for other reasons. But regardless of the reasons where Afro-pessimism can arise from, the fact of the matter, it is there. The fact of the matter is that it does affect investment decisions, and it affects consumer behavior. And I was a little disconcerted when I saw Omdia's latest scores on the digital strategy benchmarking, where China Mobile is outpacing everybody. But we're still sort of seeing every operator that's got an African presence, and MTN Group in particular, just not quite cracking a 2/3 score. And I'm sort of wondering, is this just lag? Is this just a case of we needed to get the fundamentals right, and that the score will go from, it's at the moment, they've pegged it to 17 out of 35, so not quite a pass. But by 2023, it'll be at 21, 22, and it'll accelerate and eventually catch up to China Mobile? Or are there other challenges on the horizon? Is this sort of a state of things? And are there mismatches in the strategy? Are there lessons that we've learned that we've now got to go and rewrite parts of the strategy?
Right. No, Paul, I think your question is actually asked and answered at the same time, right? I think when you look at the stance of MTN Group, first of all, we are hugely optimistic and committed to driving digital within the continent. And you rightly said it. I think when you look at the study by Omdia, what you see there is a stack of operators, but under the surface you also see a stack of geographical presence and geographical presence differences, right? So to answer your question very sharply, I do think it's a case of lag. I don't think there are any gaps in terms of the strategic intent and the strategic outlay of initiatives and interventions that are being ran by any of the operators that are on the lower scale of the spectrum. However, there are some market realities that are starkly different between the African continent and Europe's, the Americas, the Asias of this world. where before we talk digital, we have to contend with things like electrification, as an example. Before we start talking digital solutions, there are populations that don't have electricity. Before we start talking digital solutions, we have to crack the smartphone problem. Before we start talking, full digitization, there are things around policy and framework that need to be a bit more crafted to propel the momentum around digital solutions. So I do think that it's a case of lag, and because the strategic intent is there and it's clear, I truly believe it's only a matter of time. And if it's one continent that is, so promising in the potential of the future, it really is Africa.
Great. No, I'm inclined to that sort of view, which is possibly why it was a bit of asked and answered.
Yeah.
I think if a deep dive is done, and I'm confident that that the firms are trying to do deep dives, that there are areas where the strategic plans are a little bit off, and there's a need to sort of go and iterate improvements on the strategy in order to improve execution. I think, of the realities on the ground, regulators are a big concern, and the political realities are also there. And that sort of leads me to the final question that I actually would just like your parting thoughts on, and that is that Africa has recently concluded, and there is huge promise in a continental free trade area.
Right.
There are a few things lining up that allows for a fourth industrial revolution. There are many governments that have woken up to the importance. Do you see a sort of a situation in which telcos have a bigger role to play in enabling fintech, in enabling trade on the continent, in allowing a lot of these stars that are lining up to work? And what other than connectivity can telcos do that won't hurt their own shareholders? And do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, the trade agreement presents a huge opportunity. And before I even talk about telco, I mean, just for the continent itself. And I think the last 2.5 years have taught us or cemented in our minds the importance of self-reliance on the continent, right? Because, any disruptions in the Europes, whether it's through COVID or whether it's even through the recent Russia-Ukraine conflict, does have quite significant knock-on effects in terms of our supply chain frameworks and supply chain rhythms that we have on the continent. So I think there's a greater understanding across all countries, across all governments, that the importance of self-reliance cannot be understated any longer. Enter now this trade agreement across the continent, which, as you rightly said, would be greatly supported not only by the infrastructure that we provide as mobile telecom operators, but also with the maturity of payment platforms that are cemented by mobile money, as an example. That is going to allow, really ease of trade across the various geographies. And the good thing about being a pan-African mobile operator such as MTN is that we have footprints or we have presence in at least 16 countries across the continent. Now, all of us, barring a couple of operations, are really mature mobile money establishments, which, given the interconnection between all our operations, could actually unlock payments across various borders. So apart from the infrastructure, which of course we must maintain to remain digitally connected, I do see huge opportunity in supporting intracontinental trade through payment gateways such as mobile money, which is quite a huge investment area for the MTN Group at the moment.
Great. Thank you so much. And looking forward to seeing you probably at next year's East Africa Com and possibly Africa Com.
Definitely. Thanks for having me, Paul. Great chatting with you.
Great. Lovely to have this chat. Thank you.